Welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me today is wine writer and blogger Brian Yost, and we'll be talking about MidAtlantic wine tourism. Thank you so much for joining me, Brian.
Well, thank you. And so I've been doing this for, I came to Virginia in 1995. And on the first day that I arrived in Virginia, I went to a winery. I went to Oakencroft, which is no longer open. And when I went to Oakencroft, I knew that there was Virginia wine, but I didn't really know anything about it. And the one thing that I would say about my first experience with Virginia wine was that the reds were not very complex. The whites were like way too acidic. That was my first experience, and I began to explore a little bit. And I went back to Oakencroft right before they closed, which was in the early 2000s, maybe around 2003. And I saw this dramatic improvement in their wine over that period of time. During the same period of time, a lot of wineries were opening, and it was sort of a hobby that I would go out on the weekends and I would check out some of these different wineries. And I began to develop an interest in it. And so I decided, I'd been doing some writing anyway, and I was thinking about writing a blog, and I decided that I would write about wine. And I started looking at, 5-6 years ago, I started looking more closely, and I began visiting Virginia wineries with the idea of promoting Virginia wine.
Right, because in the time since you've been blogging, I'm sure you've seen an exponential growth in the number of wineries.
Oh, not just in the wineries, but in the last 10 years, the quality of that wine has just gone through the roof. There was an influx of experienced winemakers in the early 2000s that began to contribute to that quality of wine. So there's a lot of experience coming from out of the country, from the West Coast, from other winemaking regions, and creating a much better product. So we've seen this sort of trajectory and the improvement in the quality of the wine sort of across the board in the last 10 years. And so this is the thing that is sort of motivating me to go on and write more.
Right, so we tend to think of things as industries, wine industry, but there's an inherent flaw in thinking in terms of industry because it's very isolating. When you think of the Virginia wine industry, tell us why that is not going to work to expand or scale or draw in the necessary flow of dollars and consumer, patronage by thinking in those terms.
Right. That's a really good question. What I would say is one of the things that I'm seeing is I am seeing some cooperation among wineries. You see that there are, the expansion of wine trails is a way to market wine. But when you think in broader terms, what you're really attracting is local
people who live
business,
here, right?
Charlottesville's drawing on the greater Charlottesville area to those people being drawn out to local wineries. You see Northern Virginia is being drawn out to Loudoun, Fauquier counties, down to Rappahannock for weekend wine tasting. But it is slightly limiting in the sense that you've got these people coming out for a day and going home. You've got this great product that you cannot get outside this area because the nature of the industry, these small boutique wineries cannot really sell and make any money in retail, so they want to try and sell direct to consumer. At the same time, you've got all these people in these large urban centers on the East Coast. When they think wine tourism, they're thinking Napa, they're thinking Tuscany, they're thinking Burgundy. Probably more than anything, they're thinking Napa. They're flying across the United States to have an experience that they could have right here in the Mid-Atlantic. Now, I'm not just talking Virginia. I'm talking about, I've seen the expansion and improvement of wine in Maryland. I've tasted some great wines from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. The broader Mid-Atlantic as a region is really, the quality has taken off, and there's so much to do here, but we are not really thinking in those terms. When we think tourism, we're thinking about a weekend at the beach. You've got
right.
even there, it's really a more local initiative. And when we're thinking about wine, we're thinking really at a winery level. We're not thinking about hospitality and all the other things that go with
So
that.
if we want people to come from New York or South Dakota to Virginia, we're talking about wine, we're talking about battlefields, we're talking about museums, we're talking about canoeing, kayaking, hiking, we're talking about farm-to-table restaurants. We're talking about how do you get to these places? Are you staying at a hotel? Are you staying at a bed and breakfast? How do you navigate it? So tourism is all of those things, and yet we seem to be in silos where all of these different parts of tourism in Virginia are not necessarily recognizing they need to weave together a more attractive package for people from out of state. Would that be about right?
I would say that that's exactly right. I think that we could be thinking, and you could think in terms of, in municipal or county or state terms. You could think in much broader terms about what this region has to offer. If you were going to put together a really dynamic campaign, and you really want to compete with the West Coast, for instance, you could talk about all the things that there are to do here in addition to wine. In fact, I would even argue that we have a lot more going on in terms of history,
Right.
colonial history, Civil War history,
Right.
The outdoor opportunities in the mountains we've got right across the border in Front Royal. We've got the national capital for canoeing, right? So there's all these outdoor things that you could be doing, and you could be bundling that as part of a larger package that's going to get you out to some of the wineries.
So this sounds to me like it's itinerary driven, right?
Absolutely
So is
right.
that where we're missing the opportunity, or is the opportunity lost here somebody to put together an itinerary, a travel package of some kind?
I think that's right. I'm seeing some signs of this, but really, really in their infancy. There's a company, I have a friend that runs wine tours, Wine to Vine concierge service out of Vermont, where he's marketing Virginia to people in the Northeast. I know he was running a trip. He's bringing people from New York and Delaware in sometime in the near future. But I'm not seeing a lot of that. And yeah, I think that we're not looking at the big picture. He's putting together this sort of concierge package, which is sort of all-inclusive, that has all the things that someone might want to do when they come here. But if you had something that was more itinerary-driven, if you had something that was more map-driven, perhaps, where you're going to go to Frederick, Maryland,
Right.
And you want to see what there is to do around Frederick, Maryland, all the little pins in the map could indicate, places to dine or to stay, or wineries, or other points of interest. I mean, all of this stuff could be inclusive so that you can see this. I think we were talking earlier, and I used the analogy of driving down the highway and seeing, when you're coming up on an exit, it tells you the gas stations, the lodging, and the local
right?
restaurants, and I know there are a few where you'll see wineries or other points of interest, right? But it's you don't see that till you come up on it. If you had a digital platform that could provide that kind of information, that would allow you to sort of plan your trip in ways that you can't really do right now. And one of the problems is you look is with maps, just with physical maps. Virginia does a winery map, right? But
Right.
Virginia stops at the border.
Right.
You can't see that right across the border there are all these other wineries in Maryland. Same thing in Maryland. You're not looking really into Pennsylvania or Delaware or New Jersey. So you're really looking at best, we're looking at a state level, but we're also just looking at a winery level.
Right.
We're not looking beyond that. We're not looking at the other businesses, and not just hospitality and restaurants, all the places where there's shopping. If you're pulling somebody into Middleburg, Virginia, and you're going to stay out at Salamander, what else is around there?
Right.
They could probably tell you that at Salamander, right? But you're also pulling people into an area that offers shopping opportunities as well. So I don't think, we're definitely not thinking about it sort of holistically. We're not looking in the aggregate at all the things that could be accomplished.
And people don't know what they don't know. A great example is Tom and I were in Williamsburg for a meeting that he had, and we decided to go from Williamsburg, where there are wineries nearby, up the coastal highway to stay at Chincoteague Island. And so leaving Chincoteague Island, we passed Lewis Delaware Ferry to Cape May. And Tom goes, oh, we should go to Cape May sometime. I'm like, oh, we should. But we did not allow time in our trip to actually do that, because we didn't think about it till we saw the sign that said Lewis Delaware Ferry. And I'm like, oh yeah, Cape May. So this is the opportunity that is lost. People don't know what they don't know until they drive up on it and they're like, oh, we should do that, but we didn't factor it in, so it's not part of our trip this time.
Right. And I think that we're beginning to see, I'm seeing some signs of startups that are beginning to look at this in a different way. I've been working with bindotrips.com, who does itineraries. They partner with booking.com. I'm trying to work with them. I'm planning to work with them in the MidAtlantic in particular, but they're doing itineraries. Itineraries that include sort of insider tips on things that you could do that you might not know about if you didn't visit Bindu, because these are itineraries that are being written by somebody local. Another startup that's doing something along the same lines, Fermented Lifestyle is one that's just starting up, that they're partnering with different businesses in wine regions, but looking beyond that, looking in cities at wine bars, but looking at things around the wine industry, and providing discounts to their subscribers, and eventually maybe even beginning to offer tours. So they're sort of in their infancy right now. But I was arguing, and I think that they believe that the way to do that is going to be some sort of a map-driven system, where if I'm going to go to Cape May in New Jersey, and I want to go to wineries, well, I can look at my app, or I can look at the site, and I can see from the map what sort of opportunities there are there beyond winery. And because the truth is that the average wine tourist only goes to 2 wineries.
And you're right about that. So when we come back from this break, we're going to talk a little bit more with Brian Yost, who is a wine writer and blogger, about where the opportunities are in the Mid-Atlantic.
Okay, so we drowned the fire, stirred it, drowned it again, and now just feel if it's cold.
Yeah.
Cool.
Smokey just gave me a bear hug.
I know. I already posted it.
Here's your check. Oh, you got it. Since I got rid of my car, I really enjoy walking.
Okay. God, no.
Getting pulled over for buzz driving could cost you around $10,000 in fines, legal fees, and increased insurance rates.
Oh, you're home early.
You live with your mom?
That'll set your game back a few years. Buzzed, busted, and broke. Because buzz driving is drunk driving.
This is the moment I knew his future had no boundaries.
There are some moments only the forest can inspire. Find yours at discovertheforest.org.
Welcome back to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we're talking with Brian Yost, a wine writer and blogger with the Virginia Grape, and we are talking about the Mid-Atlantic wine tourism industry. And thank you so much for being here, Brian.
Oh, you're welcome, Catherine. It's a
So
pleasure.
let's talk a little bit about California. I mean, when people think about domestic wine, when they think about good wine in the United States, they're talking about California wines. But it wasn't always that way.
No, in fact, if you go back to the 1970s, right, if you walked into a grocery store in the 1970s, what did you see on the shelf? Like, you saw jug wine,
Yeah.
and you saw, Thunderbird and Ripple and things like that. The very fine line between fine wine
Right.
and wino,
Right.
and wino. So, most of the domestic wine industry was devoted to jug wines. I mean, that was really because there was no sophistication. A few things happened. Julia Child was a huge catalyst in the industry in introducing food and wine to the American public together. We didn't think in those terms. In California, there were some attempts to break out with making fine wine, and you saw this in the early 1970s, in the Judgment of Paris, where a few California wineries go over and just blow the doors off of some French wines. But at the time, there was no real industry, but this was sort of the starting point, right? So it begins in California. California, if you look at the numbers for California relative to even the rest of the West Coast, if California were a separate country, it would be the 6th largest producer in the world. It's really almost impossible to compete with California because anybody can grow grapes there. I was talking to a local winery owner recently who was telling me if it weren't for humidity, hurricanes, and frost, Virginia would be exactly like California, right? But we've got these challenges on the East Coast. If you look at sort of the numbers of East Coast wineries and how those and production, how that plays out, I mean, we're still dwarfed. Even if you add those numbers up, we're dwarfed by California. When people think of wine tourism, they largely think of Napa. Most people go to Napa.
And some of that's weather related. Let's be honest. The thing about California weather is that almost any time of the year, the weather's good. They don't necessarily have the same 4 seasons the way the Mid-Atlantic experiences the same 4 seasons.
Well, that's largely true, I think, and particularly as you go further south in California. I mean, that is definitely a factor. But I think if you're looking at the Mid-Atlantic as if you're looking at all those states together, you really do have a lot to offer, and you have a lot to offer in terms of numbers of wineries.
Right.
If we were to go a little further north and add New York into that equation, currently the largest producers are California's obviously number one.
Right.
Makes more wine than the rest of the United States combined. Washington State is number 2 by quite a bit. Oregon, New York is number 3. It's the number 3 producer. Then Oregon and Virginia in that order. So we could easily compete against the Northwestern. But we can also compete against California if we're bundling all the other activities that there are to do in the Mid-Atlantic and not just focusing on wine. I mean, wine can be a piece of it, but it's only one piece.
That's true. So let's talk about New York and how their wineries are structured, because obviously you have New York City in New York, right? Which is, tourism in New York, they already have a running start because of New York City. But really it's the Finger Lakes District. There's upstate New York.
Yep, there are really 4 that come to mind right offhand. There's the Finger Lakes, which is the oldest. Really they've been making fine wine there since the early 70s as well. Although it's a slightly different story for the Finger Lakes. There were some instances where people were trying to make fine wine, but it really was making wine for the jug wine industry. And when the bottom fell out of that industry, these are groups of farmers that just retooled. They figured out what they could produce in the Finger Lakes that was and make quality wine, and they've really made a run for it. And I think they've got the lead on most of the East Coast.
Right.
But you've also got Long Island. There's some great wineries out there. You've got the Hudson Valley, still kind of in its early days, but with some real potential. And then you've got the area up around Niagara.
Right.
That I guess it's the Niagara Plateau. That there's some decent wines coming out of that. So you've got 4 major parts of the, and I don't mean to diss any other part of New York. I'm sure there are wines being made in other parts as well, but those are the 4 that come to mind.
Right. So New York is a major player. So they're number 3, and they are at the top of the Mid-Atlantic. In fact, we could even argue that maybe there's a reason that New York, being on the edge of the Mid-Atlantic, might be part of trying to market more East Coast wineries, or the industry being on the East Coast.
I think New York struggles with the same thing, with the same problems that everybody else does. It's tough to grow grapes there. There's a very thin margin for success in New York, just as there is, all the way down to through Virginia and into North Carolina. But they're also struggling for a market share. They're trying to get in, the New York wines are trying to get into the New York City market, and they're struggling with that. So just imagine, the Finger Lakes has really a significant amount of head start on Virginia and Maryland and some of the other players, and they're not able to break into that market. They're also struggling to pull, to lure tourists out there.
Right.
Just as, and I wouldn't say that we're struggling exactly from a lack of tourism. I would just say that we're struggling from a lack of cohesion. Sort of putting together good packages that include more than just wine, but include other things that the region has to offer, and that's, I think, where we compete with Napa. When we think Napa, we're thinking wine. It's not that there's no place to eat or stay there, but we've got tons of other things on the East Coast.
But that has predominated, and part of that is just, it's the way Napa has been branded to mean wine. Napa Valley has been branded to mean wine. Mid-Atlantic has not been branded to mean wine.
Right. I think that even if you look at, when you look at the West Coast, if you go a little further south, Napa's fairly far north.
It is.
I mean, they do have a winter, maybe not quite as severe as some of the winters in the Northeast, but they still do have a winter. So they have a time of year that's more more lucrative for tourism. But you go further south to Paso Robles down the Central Coast. They're still struggling against Napa. They were recently, I think, selected or designated one of the top wine tourism areas in the United States, and they can't even get market share from Napa. But I think that we have a lot more to offer in the Mid-Atlantic than any single wine area in California. We're not producing the amount of wine, we're certainly producing quality wine, and I think that we have many other things that we can offer. I think we talked about farm to table.
Yeah, restaurants,
and, yes,
right?
Restaurants.
We have historic sites, battlefields, museum, kayaking, hiking, mountains, beaches, lakes.
Exactly.
I mean, we have everything in the Mid-Atlantic region.
We do.
So it seems to me that in talking about growing the wine industry, it really is going to be dependent on tourism to a certain degree, but it's not necessarily coming together that we are promoting Mid-Atlantic wine tourism to equal wine.
Because we're still thinking local. I started out as the Virginia grape. I mean, because I was thinking about Virginia. And then I went to the Winter Wine Showcase in Baltimore and tasted these amazing Maryland wines and thought, oh my God, there's so much more going on here than I ever realized. And it's not that I hadn't been looking, because I really had been looking at wineries from New England down to Georgia. But the quality of wine just really stood out for me, what's happening in Maryland. And then I was at conferences where I'm tasting New Jersey wine and Pennsylvania wines. The quality is there, maybe not the quantity, but certainly the quality, and I think a lot of other things.
So let's get prescriptive. Brian. What do you see going forward that could be done among hospitality, transportation, food, wine, existing centers like, Williamsburg is suffering. Their foundation is in serious financial trouble because tourism has dropped off around Williamsburg. But what are they missing? about not figuring out how to bring people to Colonial Williamsburg and tying in, as we were saying, itinerary-driven activities that's not just Colonial Williamsburg.
Well, I think this is the problem. We tend to think in a very insular way about promoting our own institution, whatever that might be. One of the, you know, I talked about a couple of the initiatives in the first half of the show. The other thing that I was talking with Nancy Bowers, another local wine writer, does Virginia Wine in My Pocket, and we were talking about pulling together sort of a small conference of writers as a starting point. And I would like to expand that beyond Virginia. I mean, we were kind of talking about Virginia, but pulling together some writers from the Mid-Atlantic to get together and let's start thinking about this let's start thinking in the aggregate, start thinking outside of just wine. I started thinking that way a few years ago. And I think there are some other people. I think Nancy Bauer is one of those people also is thinking beyond just the wine industry. But I think we have to look at these other businesses and we have to involve them in some way. It's going to be a hard sell, I will tell you, because it's tough to get, you know, somebody that's got a brick and mortar business that's been established for some time to begin to think about businesses around them. But we don't live in a bubble, right? I mean, I think we sort of rise and fall as a group, and I think that by cross promoting and promoting other players in the region, you're only strengthening that region. So if we can think in that way, and if we start with writers, but I think we have to move beyond that, and I think we have to get government involved in that as well. I would really love to see Virginia take a lead in this.
Oh, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think there's opportunities for wine tourism boards, and every state has a tourism board. Sure. I think there is a place for chambers of commerce on a local level or a county level to understand that they need to reach across the county line, you know, whether it's Fauquier, Loudoun, Fairfax, and some of these other, to understand that we can't just draw these invisible lines and work in our own bubble. We really have to reach across.
Right, right.
And I really appreciate you being here today, Brian. You have opened up this vista for us to think about the wine industry in a completely different way. And I hope that our viewers understand that we need to be thinking about Mid-Atlantic wine tourism as beyond just Virginia. Please visit thevirginiagrape.com to find out more about Brian Yost and his writings about local wineries. And this is what you need to know.